Well, good afternoon. What a great afternoon it is, isn't it? My name is Chuck Anderson. I'm a member here at Paul's Church Presbyterian. I'm also an avid armchair historian, so I'm a little jealous of Myra today that she gets to be the moderator on this. Welcome to the first chapter in season 4 of the Crooked Steeple Literary Festival. Crooked Steeple is, and excuse the pun, a novel program of community outreach sponsored by Paul's Church Presbyterian Church, the Capital Area Presbyterian, and our bookstore sponsor, Bard's Alley. So let's give them all a big hand. So before we start, I have a few housekeeping items. One is if you could sort of fill in the chairs to the center, so if we have some people coming in late, they can sort of get to the outer row. I think we're okay. It looks like the crowd entry has settled down, so we're probably okay. If you see those friendly folks in white shirts and bandanas, they are here for anything you need. So if you have any questions or comments or anything, just look for one of those people and they'll be able to help you. They are serving a very important role here today, and that is they will be collecting the 3x5 cards with your questions on them. At the end of the discussion, we're going to try to get in as many questions as possible, so I would suggest that you write them down before the end and to pass them to one of the people circulating before that so that we can take a look at them and see if we can get them in. I'm sure we're not going to be able to get them all in, but we'll do the best we can. Again, I'd like to thank the sponsors, including Bard's Alley Bookshop in Vienna. Yay, Vienna. Amy is here from Bard's Alley. She's got the books for sale after the discussion. You can get one from her and then go to the table. I'm not sure exactly where the table will be, but Charles will be there to the side of the books. Okay. Capital Area Presbyterian, as I mentioned, they have provided financial support for this, and we're very grateful for that. And of course, Falls Church Presbyterian has provided finances, locations, logistics, and sweat equity. So thank you, Falls Church Presbyterian. So I'd like to introduce our special guest today. Charles King is our first author of the Crooked Steeple 4th season. He grew up on a cattle farm in the Ozark foothills of northwest Arkansas. He studied history and philosophy at the University of Arkansas and later earned master's and doctoral degrees at Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar. Before coming to Georgetown, he was a junior research fellow at New College, by the way, which is not that new, 1379 people, okay, and a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He has a day job as a professor of international affairs and government at Georgetown, where he has served as chair of both the Department of Government and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Services. Somehow, he's found the time to write a number of books on a wide variety of topics, including Gods of the Upper Air, Midnight at the Para Palace, Odessa, and Extreme Science. Wow, that is a wide variety. Interviewing Charles today is our own Myra Bridgeforth, co-creator with Ian Mugler of the Crooked Steeple Literary Festival. Myra is also a renowned person of Vienna. Yay, Vienna! A psychotherapist, which I think is actually quite appropriate to be a moderator for this particular book. She's a poet, she's an artist, she is a first part soprano, an active church member, and book lover. So, with no further ado, I turn it over to Charles and Myra.
Okay, this is working. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do my best. Just wave at me or something, because I want everybody to hear. What was your experience with the Messiah before you started researching this book? I wondered if you grew up singing it.
Yeah, I did, first of all, delighted to be here. Thanks everybody for coming out. So I am not a musicologist, I'm not a music historian. I'm a music lover and amateur musician. I might get to 4 chords on the guitar rather than 3, but not much sort of beyond that. And I didn't really grow up singing this, other than occasionally in my little Pentecostal church in northwest Arkansas, we might manage a Hallelujah chorus with no harmony. But we might manage that during the Christmas season. But my wife and my wife is a musician, we'd always loved this thing, and it's always kind of around. We are so used to hearing this music, especially in the season that we're now entering, that it just kind of washes over many of us. It's kind of there in the background, kind of like, it's the pumpkin spice latte sonically in the season for many people. Not for any of you, I'm sure. And during COVID, my wife and I were having loads of family difficulties, like lots of folks. We had a serious health issue in our family, and we had friends who were trying to have kids and were having a hard time doing that. And it just seemed like everybody was in one kind of tragic or difficult situation after the next. And then we live on Capitol Hill, and so then there was January 6th, which was 6 blocks from our house. And in the middle of all of this, I needed something to make us feel better, And some time ago, I purchased an old Victrola for my wife Maggie for Valentine's Day. And I had this crazy idea. We all had crazy ideas during COVID, right? I had this crazy idea that if I could find the oldest recording of this piece of music and put it on this Victrola, that would be sort of big magic somehow. And so I did what you would do, which I went to eBay to see if I could find the oldest recording, and I did. This 1927 recording from London, Westminster Hall. And it arrived, and I put it on. And then when the first, there's the overture that goes from a minor key to a major key, and then there's the beautiful recitative, or an accompanied recitative, as it says in the original. And when those first words came out, the violinist stopped and the tenor comes out from nowhere, like this distant trumpet almost. And the first words, which you all know, have been the same since 1742, "Comfort ye." And we just, Maggie and I just both burst into tears right at that point. And I thought, well, I want to follow that emotion in a way. Let me follow that emotion, because you go to any performance this time of the year, perhaps you yourself will experience this. People are tearing up around you, they're weeping. And regardless of their religious connection to this piece of music, it means so much to so many people, and I wanted to find out in a way why that was.
I'm assuming that you just answered my second question, so. I was wondering, was this very different as a motivation for starting a book than any of your previous books?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I write history books, and I teach history and political science. But most of my subjects have been, at one remove. Like, I'm kind of intellectually interested in the topic. I might even be moved at some point by the story I'm trying to tell. And that's usually when I know I finally figured out what a book is about, if I'm moved by it in some way. But this one was really much more personal, I think, because it was impossible to ignore the parallels between kind of the things we were all experiencing in this time and the things that the protagonists in the book are experiencing, because it was this great monumental example of hope, of how to be hopeful in the world. This monument to hope came out of a time that turned out to be, for most of the people involved in it, the lowest point in their lives, and a moment in history where every piece of evidence you had in front of you suggested that the world was hopeless. And yet, this thing gets created in the middle of war, of political tumult, of incredible political divisions that actually make ours look like kid stuff, I have to tell you, of incredible mortality, of disease, and the people whose lives intersect in the making of this work of art were all, in their own ways, people who were experts in the possibility of hope. And so I thought, well, what can I learn from the lives they led?
The story of Charles Jennens and George Frederick Handel is about two complicated souls who created this gorgeous piece of music despite really incredibly difficult obstacles to that ever happening. And I'd never heard of Charles Jennens. It makes me sort of felt stupid, like I'd never heard of him before I read your book. So I wanted you to tell us about the story of your collaboration.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, most people have never heard of Charles Jennens, and one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to help resurrect him. There is no monument to him other than to his role, and there's a monument in a small country church in Leicestershire to his role as a philanthropist, but nothing about his role in creating Messiah. So he was an incredibly wealthy landowner in the English Midlands. His family had made its fortune in the iron trade right at the beginning of what would become the Industrial Revolution, one of the wealthiest families in Britain. But Jennens himself, and this is in the early 1700s, so he's born in 1700. Jennens himself suffered from what at that time in the 18th century was called the HYP, H-Y-P, which was short for hypochondria. But it didn't mean a kind of imaginary illness or oversensitivity as we would use that term now. The HYP in the 18th century was the male equivalent of hysteria in women. So if in the medical philosophy of the time, if hysteria was about being overly agitated and manic, hypochondria was the opposite. It was what we might now call chronic depression or even bipolar disorder. And if you read Jennens' letters, and we have more than 100 that have survived, it's very clear when he's in a kind of manic phase and when he's in a very depressed and low phase. And the way he sort of got himself out of these moments was art. He was one of the great art collectors in Britain at the time. He collected music manuscripts. One of the oldest manuscript copies of Vivaldi's Four Seasons that we have was in his library, now resides at British University Library. And Handel was his drug of choice, because Handel at this stage was the most popular composer in Britain. He was court composer to George I, to George II. He was premiering Italian opera in London at this time. And Jennens, during the London season, would go to every performance, everyone he could go to. He collected Handel's manuscripts, and at some point, as sometimes wealthy patrons will do, he approached Handel and said, I've got a great idea for an opera. He himself was not a musician, but he approached Handel with an idea for an opera. They collaborated together on various things. But unbeknownst to Handel, Jennens was working on this ladder, in a way, to get himself out of the abyss. And the ladder was the libretto for Messiah. So at some point in 1739, 1740, he started pulling down the King James Version of the Bible from his library shelves, and books on theology and philosophy. He started copying down Bible verses, and then started rearranging them. Because for all of you who know the text of Messiah, nothing is in the biblical order. It's 100% composed of Bible verses or interpreting, or Bible verses sent through the Book of Common Prayer, if you like. But nothing's in the order in the original scriptures. They're in the order that Charles Jennens wanted you to hear them in. Because the entirety of Messiah is actually not just the story of the prophecy and suffering and the glorification of Jesus Christ, the essence of the Christian story, if you like. It is Charles Jennens' journey out of misery. Like, where would you start if you're trying to create your ladder out of this dark abyss, what would you start with? Well, you start with comfort eating. That's where you start. And then you begin to work backwards. Interpret your life. Interpret the things that happen in your day. Interpret your week. Interpret all the bad things that are going to happen to you. And Messiah goes to some very dark places, right in the middle. But interpret that in light of the first words that you sang already. And that's Jennings, so this great collaboration, he shipped this off to Handel. It came through Handel's letterbox. He had no idea Jennings was working on this. And eventually, we can talk about this as another part of the story. Handel eventually composes the music for this in 24 days, which is not unusual, actually. I mean, we desperately want an angel to be on Handel's shoulder, and who is to say where angels sit? But this was very normal for Handel. He was composing, remember, for the stage. He's really a stage and public performance composer, and he's always on deadline. And so he composes very, very quickly. There are bits of Messiah that are recycled from other things that he had composed earlier, actually. And then this premiered in 1742 in Dublin. But this was a collaboration between these two men, and we have to kind of really remember that it's George and Ira Gershwin, it's Elton John and Bernie Taupin who created these great works of art, and we should think of that collaboration as being essential to it.
We often think of the. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. We often think of the Enlightenment as a time of great discovery and change in how people thought and acted. The world moving forward in a positive way. And you expand the scope to tell the story of a time of great tragedy, loss, degradation, and shame. Can you tell us some more about that contradiction?
Yeah, well, of course, these people are writing in the thing that we have come to call the Enlightenment. Of course, they didn't really yet know they were in a thing called the Enlightenment. The word hadn't even been applied to their period yet. That wouldn't come until about 40 years after Messiah is premiered. But they knew something was happening. We were applying reason and rationality to the great problems of the day. And, from your Western Civ courses, we were all probably taught in one form or another that this is the moment when darkness recedes and light comes in, when rationality and reason and skepticism and empiricism and science win out, in a way, over religion and over superstition. But the people who lived through this moment, first of all, wouldn't have experienced it that way. And secondly, all of these people lived in a deeply religious moment in which they didn't really see these things as being in contradiction. They didn't see the idea of revelation and discovery as being polar opposites. They didn't see wonder as being the opposite of rationality, and awe being somehow incompatible with science. These things were deeply braided together and wrapped together for them, especially for a figure like Charles Jennings. Because one of the other subtexts of Messiah is his attempt to defend a certain version of Christianity that puts wonder, awe, and revelation at the center of the Christian experience. He was very worried about the rationalizing trends, the growth of deism in this period that in many ways the American founders are the inheritors of. He felt that was missing a key element of the mystery at the heart of any religious experience. In fact, his younger brother Robert had gone up to Oxford as an undergraduate and had met some of these skeptical, rationalizing philosophers of the day, and later died by suicide. And Jennings always believed that in some ways it was this loss of the sense of wonder, awe, and mystery at the core of his brother's experience that was responsible for his own despair. So, what also comes out of the Enlightenment in this period is not just science and yay science, and we're wonderful that we have that great discovery. But what also comes out of it, I think, is the sense that all of these things are in some deep way compatible. The great theme of the Enlightenment is not the triumph of rationality, it's in fact the idea of hope. that there are human solutions to our problems if we apply every bit of ourselves to them. Not just our brains, but our spirits and our souls, our ingenuity, our sense of humanity. If we apply all of ourselves to the great problems of the day, problems are solvable in some fashion. Because you have to remember the world these people were living in. A time of war, of incredible disease, infant mortality in London. You will not believe this figure, but infant mortality in London at the time was 75%. So 75% of children would not live to the age of 5. So I like to think of that first performance of Messiah, and where everybody out in the audience, so there were about 600 people in the audience, everybody in that audience would have buried, if they had children, buried more children than they ever saw to adulthood. And that simple fact of confronting a deeply dark world, but singing about a world that is better, and in fact is going to look like the opposite of the world as we experience it now, that is the essence of hope to me, and that also is a product of the Enlightenment.
When I read the introduction to the book, for those of you that have not read it, I give myself permission if I own a book to mess with it, write in it, underline things, fold down the pages. It's like you're messing with the book. But I underlined so many quotes, and I just was so struck with how much you were giving away in the introduction to the book. But at the end, it made me realize there's no way after you read the introduction that you don't keep reading. So I just wrote down 4 of them, and I'm just going to hand these to you and have you read them to us and tell us something about it.
Oh, sure. Okay. So I'm going to quote myself here. My wife says I don't do it all the time, so the Messiah doesn't so much seek solace in the scriptures as put them to use. Listen closely enough to the words, and what emerges is a set of linked meditations on the proper way of seeing the human predicament. Which I think is right, and that's what I was saying earlier, that, look at the text of Messiah, like really read the text in addition to singing it, and you'll find, oh yes, whether I know it or not, I've been taken on this kind of spiritual journey in a way. I'm thinking toward the possibility of hope through the scriptural verses that Jennings, in this particular order, has wanted me to hear. Even without the theology, the core messages come through. To remake the world, start by rethinking it. This moment is not eternity, this particular misery, part of a larger story. There's comfort in placing yourself in the cosmos. Failing to comprehend the vastness that feels like defeat may turn out to be the most glorious moment of your life. At its most profound, Messiah lays out an entire method for seeing the uses of adversity, not by naively claiming that life is easy or always beautiful, but by starting from the premise that the world, long before we enter it, is infused with purpose. And that's what Jennings, I think, believed is the thing that Handel took up and sort of illustrates to us in the music. And one of the things that I've always found so moving about this text, and then of course the sung version of it in performance, is that it's giving you right at the top some lessons for how to live. There's the comfort ye bit, but you may, for those of you who know the original text of this is from the 40th chapter of the book of Isaiah, and there's no comma after the ye, by the way. Comfort ye my people, which you will all know. It's not comfort ye, my people, though it is you all be comforted. It's a command from the prophet. The prophet is saying, you comfort ye my people. You be the one to do the comforting. And I think what a tribute to this terribly depressed man, that the first thing he puts at the top is that actually it's up to me. Oh yeah, if it's up to me to do the comforting, the person who is least qualified to do it, this deeply depressed individual, it's actually up to him to do the comforting in the world. And then that, of course, moves into the aria, every valley. And every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill made low, from the same text. And that idea has been picked up time and time and time again. It's in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It's the bit that comes right before the I Have a Dream sequence, in which King is talking about what the proper world will be. What is the world that, like a properly ordered, just world? The properly ordered, just world is going to be the opposite of the world you see before you, in a way. It's a place where every high place is low, every low place is high, every crooked place is straight. And I think, just right there in the first 7 minutes of Messiah, you have an entire philosophy of how to be a little bit hopeful about your day.
Yeah.
We're taking a really big jump right now. Okay. The through-line story of Susanna Arnay, or Mrs. Cyber, is maybe my favorite in the book. She's an actress on the London stage. She's a singer. Many people don't like her voice. She's notoriously called out as a shamed woman whose husband was utterly behind the scandal and financially prospering from it, who was gloriously redeemed through the Messiah. I'd love for you to tell us how you learned about her and how she runs through the entire tale.
Yeah, well, she's my favorite too, I have to say. Susanna Sibber was born Susanna Arne, A-R-N-E. And she was born in Covent Garden in the 17 teens, so she's the youngest character of all of them in the book. Her father was an upholsterer, so he was a skilled tradesman. Her mother was a midwife. Her father also moonlighted as an undertaker. And so I like to think that the Arne family had the entire life cycle sewn up, from midwife to undertaker. But they were growing up in this moment in which the West End of London, what we now know as the West End, the theater district of London, was just getting going. That was the far west of the city of London at that time. So this new suburb was developing, new theaters and houses, row houses, townhouses were going up. And the king of the West End at this time was Handel. He was the most important practitioner of the greatest art form, popular art form of the moment, Italian opera. And that's, by the way, why we should really think of Handel. I hope I will not offend anyone in saying this. We should think of Handel as a kind of Stephen Sondheim or Andrew Lloyd Webber of the 18th century, not as just a frilly cuffed classical composer, because he wanted to affect you. He wanted his music to be listened to by as many people as possible. He once very famously said, "Oh, that I had canon. If I just had a canon, I would put it in a score." Susanna Arne, the whole Arne family growing up in the middle of all of this, and her father, who was always interested in making a buck, thinks that, well, if I could get my family involved in this new thing, opera, that is taking off, I might be able to make some money in addition to making cushions and burying people. And so he provides some music lessons to his son, Tom, the older brother of Susanna, and they trickle down to Susanna herself, and the family begins to put on sort of musical performances. They're terrible. They're terribly reviewed in the West End, but they're making some money. People are kind of buying tickets to come and see them. And by the way, her brother, Tom Arne, or for the music aficionados among you, you'll recognize the name Thomas Arne, who later goes on to become one of the most important British composers of the 18th century, creating, among other things, Rule Britannia. So that is Susanna's brother. Her father thinks, this is going pretty well. What I really need to do is get my daughter to marry into the trade. And so he essentially arranges a relationship with a man named Theophilus Cibber, C-I-B-B-E-R, hence her married name, Susanna Cibber. And Theophilus is the son of a guy named Colley Cibber, who's the Steven Spielberg of the 18th century. He's into everything. Everybody knows his name. He's a theater manager, poet laureate of the UK, hugely famous. And so this is this amazing, artful, dynastic marriage that he is now concocted. Theophilus, Susanna's husband, turns out to be an absolute nightmare. and you had mentioned this earlier, he realized he has this younger wife, he's a bit older than her, younger wife who's a kind of ingenue of the stage. She's not a great singer, but boy can she make an audience feel something. She's a natural actor at a moment when people are still doing 17th century style declaiming from the stage, and she's acting in a much more natural way, so people love her. Her husband sets up meetings, we might say, between her and other young men to pay his gambling debts and to pay his bar bill, and some of those meetings are completely chaste and others of them are not, and she becomes this terribly abused wife at the time. In fact, she writes Theophilus a letter at some point when she said, if this continues, my life will be a dying by inches, which is an incredible phrase, a dying by inches. And at some point, she falls in love with one of the men that she's met in this way who is trying to rescue her in a way. It's a strange way to meet somebody. But he becomes this sort of person that she latches onto to take her out of this horrible abusive marriage. And at some point, Theophilus discovers that they're spending time together, and what had been a business arrangement now to him looks like adultery. And so he sues the young man for alienation of affection. He didn't want to get divorced, that's very expensive and would be scandalous, but he sort of sues the young man for alienation of affection. And so this goes to trial in 1738, and in a London courtroom, all of the most intimate details of her life, her sexual life, are aired in public. Where they met, what they did, what servants saw her and this young man doing, and it ruins her. It absolutely ruins her career. She can't appear on stage anymore. She's sort of a laughing stock. And she then disappears with, by this stage, by the way, a child with this young man, William Sloper, a young girl named Molly. They kind of disappear for a couple of years in the late 1730s, early 1740s, and the next place she turns up in the historical record is in Dublin in the fall of 1741 and the spring of 1742, exactly at the time that Handel has come to Dublin to premiere this new work by Charles Jennens called Messiah, where he's looking for singers for this premiere performance. And you know, musicians at that stage would find singers wherever they could find them, musicians wherever they could find them. You didn't travel with an orchestra or travel with a choir. And he then enlists Mrs. Sipper in the premiere performance. And he gives her a very particular role, because keep in mind, she's not a great singer. She's kind of in a mezzo range, moving to an alto at this point, and she doesn't read music. She doesn't read music. So anything to be taught has to be plonk, 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 plonk at the harpsichord, you know. And shall I tell me the story? Yeah. So the story is, and so then in April 1742, when this thing premieres at Neil's Music Hall, not a church, Neil's Music Hall on Fish and Bolt Street in Dublin, he gives her the thing that she does best, which is not to sing a coloratura sort of aria, nothing very difficult, but a simple melody that depends on you feeling what the person is experiencing on stage. So he gives her Despised, Rejected, which you will know, that the singers among you will know. He was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And when she sings this, you could have heard a pin drop, you know, from people who were there, because anybody in the audience could have done the gender switch, right? She was a woman of sorrows. She was acquainted with grief. And it brings down the house, because everybody, she's so scandalously known at this point. Everybody knows that story, and that was Mrs. Sipper's contribution. And it was a moment of redemption for her, because after this, her reputation shifts. She's now famous as the famous Mrs. Zimmer who sang in the premiere of Messiah. She goes back to London. She becomes, by later in the 18th century, the most important tragedian of that time. So if you've ever heard of an actor named David Garrick, who was the most important 18th century actor on the London stage, she was his female partner. They appeared together in Romeo and Juliet, and so they were this really important pair, and she's now buried in the cloisters of Westminster Abbey. So this incredible arc of a life. And by the way, if you're a fan of an audiobook, that's why I wanted a British female voice to do the audiobook. So the audiobook is done, I couldn't believe we got her, by a wonderful actress named Juliet Stevenson, who some of you may remember opposite Alan Rickman in Truly Madly Deeply back in the day. So she does the audiobook, and she does it absolutely brilliantly.
Thomas Coram is another remarkable character who's trying to find his purpose in life, to make something better in the world, and he finally lands on the problem of foundlings. And he's raising money for foundlings, and it becomes a crucial part of the Messiah story. So tell us some more about that.
Yeah. So, I built up the whole premiere of Messiah, and at that point you think, well, let's just sing the Hallelujah chorus and fade to black, and that'll be the end of the story. But it wasn't, because this was Dublin, which in the 18th century was considered by people in London to be very much the provinces. This was summer stock theater. This was not Broadway. And people had heard that Mr. Handel had premiered something new in Dublin, and so it took 2 years then for it to come to London and premiere in London. But there was such controversy around it because, look, this thing that is essentially a pared-down version of an Italian opera, which is kind of what an oratorio is in some ways, to entirely sacred texts, which is itself weird. There's no character in it. I mean, where are the dragons and where are the wizards and, the things that you would expect to see in an Italian opera? You didn't have any of that stuff. There's no storyline to it because this is Jen's philosophical journey, right? It's not a narrative storyline like you would expect many other operas and oratorios even to be. And it was premiered in a secular music hall, not even in a church. And so there's really a lot of controversy when it moves to London. A lot of people stay away from those performances. The king doesn't go at that point because it's just too, don't want to be associated with that kind of thing. And then it kind of dies after 1745. Oh, and by the way, Charles Jennens hated it. He really thought that Handel, he said at that stage, I'm never, ever, ever going to give my words to Handel again to be so abused. He suggested a number of changes to it after 1745, musical changes, in fact, because he was an amateur musician but had a great ear. And Handel, we think, made those changes. So even the music that you're listening to is in part Jennens's music. At which point he said, it is in the main a fine composition. So, there's sort of faint praise from the press. But it would have died had it not been for the person you just mentioned, Thomas Coram. C-O-R-A-M, Thomas Coram. Coram was one of these great figures of the 18th century who was obsessed by projects. So some historians call the first half of the 18th century the great age of projects, meaning everybody had some proposal for fixing something about the world. Like amateurs in any field would have some public policy proposal for fixing a thing. And if you've ever read Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which is his satirical take on this moment when everybody has an idea for fixing things, that's what this age was. And Coram was this transatlantic sea captain. He spent a lot of time in Boston, married a Boston woman, went back and forth across the Atlantic many times in his life. By the 1730s, decided that the great project of his life was going to be the problem of foundlings, as you mentioned. And foundlings were children, not who had been orphaned because their parents had died, but children whose parents couldn't take care of them, who were very much alive, parents very much alive, but the kids had either been put out on the street or they were being poorly looked after by one of those parents. And Thomas Corr wanted to fix this problem. And so he went all around London and England at the time, signing up wealthy people to this. And he eventually founded a thing called the Foundling Hospital, which more or less invented the modern system of foster care and adoption. And in fact, the main adoption and foster care agency in Britain today is the successor of that. It's now called Cora, but it's a massive, massive charity in Britain today. The Foundling Hospital needed a way of paying for the renovation of its chapel. And the governors of the Foundling Hospital, some of the great patrons of the time, said, well, let's get, Handel has this new piece of music. Let's see if he would perform it at the Foundling Hospital. And he does, beginning in 1749, and throughout the 1750s, that, not in Westminster Abbey, not in Neil's Music Hall, not in a church, the Foundling Hospital is where most people hear Messiah to begin with. And becomes an annual thing. People start doing it every year, so our tradition of singing it every year comes directly from the Foundling Hospital experience. And when Benjamin Franklin, in the 1750s, while he was in London, went to hear it, he wrote to a friend, I've just gone to see the oratorio at the Foundling Hospital. He didn't even need to name it, because by the 1750s it had become so well known that everybody knew what he was talking about. Without Thomas Corr, it never would have happened.
One of the things that your book helped me so much in knowing how pieces of history fit together, but I didn't have any idea about the connection between Handel and the slave trade.
Yeah.
And I would like for you to share that with us.
Yeah, so I thought it was really important in this book to talk about enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade in this period. And as luck would have it, I came across a character who was an enslaved man, a man named Ayuba Jallow, or Job Ben Solomon, as he's sometimes known to history, who had been enslaved in West Africa, was sent to the American colonies, actually sold on the docks of Annapolis, as it turns out, and then was enslaved on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland, later escaped, and it was discovered at that time when he escaped that he was rather unusual because he was wildly multilingual, he was literate in several languages. It turns out that he was a sort of very high-born Muslim man from what is now the Gambia, Senegal, that sort of region of West Africa. And his enslavers at the time, the Royal African Company, which was one of the largest slave trading firms of the time, thought that he might, as a literate, well-educated, high-born individual, might in fact be useful to them if he were sent back to West Africa. And so they purchased his freedom on the eastern shore, shipped him back to London, where for a good part of the 1730s, he becomes this quite celebrated individual, this princely African figure whose portrait is painted. His portrait now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London, not too far from Suzanne Sivers, as it turns out. And it's one of the first portraits that we have of a black individual looking right at the viewer. Not as a servant in the background, but a full purposive agent of history looking right at the viewer. He eventually goes back to West Africa, and it's his story, which is one of the earliest freedom narratives that we have. A style of writing about enslavement, sometimes escape, sometimes re-enslavement, that comes all the way up through Frederick Douglass, of course. The Job Ben Solomon, Ayuba Jallow story is one of the first of these and becomes really essential later on in the later 18th century and 19th century to the abolitionist movement. The crazy thing I discovered, and I relied so much on the scholarship of other people in some parts of the book, but one thing I did discover is a document on which Ayuba Jallow and Charles Jennens appear. together. Astonishing, because they were both members, it turns out, of a thing called the Spalding Gentlemen's Society, which was a kind of learned, provincial learned society that Ayuba Jabal was given membership in as this literate Muslim man in 18th century Britain. He and the librettist to Messiah appear 2 lines apart in the membership registry. And what I think this is so hugely illustrative of is the fact that enslavement in the 18th century was everywhere. You know, everywhere you look, the architecture, the art, the wealth, the patronage, those theaters that are going up in the West End, the new building in London, everything depends on the transatlantic trade, depends on the sugar trade, which in turn depends on the forced labor of people moved out of their homes and sent across the ocean. Handel himself was not an investor in the slave trade, but he was paid. His salary from the British royal household was paid through holding accounts in the Royal African Company. So while we don't think Handel had any particular view of slavery or freedom, it was the case that even for someone of his stature, you were in one way or another implicated in this throughout the century.
Okay, my last question comes from my friend Meg right there. Hi. Are there characters that you wished particularly that you could have actually interviewed? And
yeah, I mean, I think I wish I could have interviewed all of them. I think in one form or another. Well, that would have been very helpful, actually, because, you know, I think of history writing as being this kind of exercise in the moral imagination, in the sense that you can never actually interview or meet the people you're writing about, and so you have to scrounge around for their letters or their diaries or whatever they have. And then in Ayuba Jabal's case, we have a few letters and then mainly what other people wrote about him. So I always think if you're writing history, it ought to be even easier to try to understand the people you can meet and can interview and can interact with. But I think that the person, I mean, I've said this before, the person I was so drawn to was Cibber, I think. Because she just seemed to be just a terribly interesting person who was buffeted by life in the first part of her life and was never the agent of her own destiny until she stood on the stage and sang Messiah. Yeah. And I think, you know, what a transformative moment, and to have been there to witness this transformative moment would have been astonishing. So I do wish I could have seen that. Had I lived in that time, I would already have been dead and would have suffered from the gout. So I think
okay, I'm going to help Chuck out by asking if you have questions that you've written down that you haven't passed in, do it now, because we need to pick the questions that we're going to use.
Okay, we don't have a lot of them because we're really good at this. Okay. All right. Here's your first one. By writing and researching this book, what did you learn about Handel's own character? Was he a witty or ambitious man, or jealous or vindictive, or other, or all?
That's a great question. I probably should, in answering the last question, have said Handel himself, because he's actually the hardest person to get to know of this entire array. So he didn't leave a diary. We don't have many letters of his, or the ones that we do are really about technical subjects like how best to tune an organ, and, you know, things like that. So you have to sort of reconstruct him from what other people said about him. And because he's so famous, loads of people made up stuff about him along the way. So you have to sort out what's legend versus what was actually true. The first biography of Handel was published only a year after his death, so in 1760. And one thing that we do have is Charles Jennings' copy of that biography. And Jennings has gone through it, and you have to make margin notes all the way through it. It's like, nonsense! So it's wonderful to see that, because you see someone who actually did Handel and comment on what the biography got right. got right and wrong. But from what we know of Handel, he had an incredible sense of humor. He was a real cut-up. He wasn't that serious a guy, except when it came to his own art. And when it came, so he could be an absolute demon in rehearsals. He would threaten to throw sopranos out windows, which we know that was an instance where he got very, very angry with a couple of sopranos who themselves were fighting, so he got really tired of that. And he was a real martinet when it came to rehearsing an orchestra or a choir. But and he was a great gourmand. So by the time he gets around to writing Messiah, he's really quite overweight and in ill health. So he suffered a couple of strokes. The left hand less able to play with one of his hands. So he was a really interesting figure, and I think a very fun person to be around. And he was not, I'm sorry to tell you this, he was not particularly religious. So the religious dimensions that we have in Messiah are very much, I think, Charles Jennings' contribution rather than Hand's.
Interesting. Okay, this is one where someone is asking you to drill down into a statement that you made, which was, it wasn't that uncommon for somebody to basically write out something in a relatively few days. Why was that not uncommon during that period?
It wasn't uncommon in that period for I think a couple of reasons. One, you're on deadline. And, as they say on Saturday Night Live, you go on not because it's perfect, but because it's 11:30. So everybody who's writing for the stage, time was money. Like you've got a premiere coming up, you've got to write quickly. There was also in this time a lot of self-borrowing and borrowing from others. So at various points in Messiah, for those of you who know Handel's other music, you will think, I feel like I've heard this before. And it's because you have. So there are some obscure bits that, so for example, have you ever thought about the For Unto Us a Child is Born? For unto us a child is born. Like, why say for? Like, that's not even the most important, that's not even the third most important word in that sentence, Like, for, it's because it's based on an Italian duet that Handel had written a couple of years earlier, where the first word is no, where a person's saying no. So he's saying, no, da 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 da. And he just took that melody and then added some English words. There's loads of other bits of that. If you watch the coronation of Charles III and heard Zadok the Priest, another Handel piece that is played at the coronation, every coronation since 1727 has had that. You will hear the dum-da-da, the forever and ever bit, because that's at the end of Zadok the Priest, because Handel, as a German speaker, keep in mind, and he had an accent throughout his life, he could hear the rhythms of English, I think, better than a native English speaker. And so a word like forever, well, what a great word, that's just syncopated, forever and ever. You want to keep going with that. As he does, he keeps going and going and going and going with exactly that phrase. So all of that to say that he was, I think, applying every bit of his talent as a composer to the work he was creating on deadline, with already some stuff kind of in his pocket to use.
This is a very churchy question. How did writing this book affect your perceptions of faith, either personally or as an historian?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So I grew up as a Southern Pentecostal, and my wife says that I only started calling myself a Pentecostal again, I guess, when I discovered that Denzel Washington was also a Pentecostal. And so, I'm like on the Sufi end of Christianity, that sort of ecstatic, direct experience of the divine kind of end of Christianity. And I could not be farther away in some ways from the Baroque period, Baroque churchy music as I understood it. But I think as I got to know Jennings and got to think about awe and wonder and mystery, and that, you know, how do you have these experiences of ultimate things that don't slip into what in the 18th century was called enthusiasm, which is the worst thing you could be in for 18th century English writers, was being enthusiastic about anything. So it doesn't slip over the edge out of control, but does allow you to stand for a moment and experience your own smallness in the face of everything. And that's one of the reasons that I think for the great choruses in Messiah, why they resonate with people so much, why the Hallelujah chorus in particular does, is because it is like the cosmos is sparkling kind of all around you. You know, like you're very small in that kind of moment, and you're only one part of a much bigger team at that moment if you're singing one of the choruses. And that was very moving to me, I think, and kind of allowed me to see my approach to big, divine, ultimate, cosmic things in a new way.
Okay. We got a few more questions, but I think we're out of time. So if I were to convey these questions by email, could we get an answer back from it? Okay, and then I'll try to get back to people. Just send an email to Chuck Anderson at vienna.va.gov and you'll get a hold of me. I have one final question from an L. Anderson. I don't know who that is. It is, can we sing the Hallelujah chorus? I'm sorry, dear, we don't have a choir master, and we don't have the music, and wait, excuse me? One moment, please. I'm being told by my producers that there is a choir director, Mr. Don Armstrong, in the back.
Well, to follow your words of a part of a much larger team, I invite our choir members to come and join. And Trevor Pinning and the English Consort Choir is going to join us in my concert master. Sing along, don't sing along, but feel the comfort and the joy that George and I are working to wrote for us together. He said, hit it, Turner. Hit it, Turner. You gotta stand for all of this chorus. Louder.
Hallelujah. here to share this experience this afternoon. Falls Church Presbyterian is a Christian people grounded in hope, all evidence outside to the contrary. And we are grounded in making community and connection, and owning our history and supporting people in need of support. And we seek not to minister to, but to minister with. And partnership requires knowing each other's stories. So you might think that it is strange for a church to have a literary festival, but Crooked Steeple is one of our ways that we help more people share more stories, to get to know each other and recognize ourselves in others. And this literary festival is our gift to the community, with the community. And by being here today, you all are now part of our community. And I invite you to join us in perpetuating and expanding this gift to the community. And you can do that by continuing to attend Crooked Steeple events and sharing news about it, inviting someone to come, and of course, financially. It is a gift, but if you feel moved to make a donation, our recommended donation is $20. We will always accept more. And if you want to give a lot more, please talk to Ann Mugler or Myra in the back there. So thank you so much for coming today.
One adjacent invitation, and just as Handel's Messiah brings people together, whether you have faith or you don't have faith, music does that in general. We're having a cantata on December the 7th during our worship service, Bach's Ruft auf uns die Stimme. And there will be live musicians, there will be no stereo that jumbles in and out. But please come and enjoy that with us. It's during our regular service at 10 a.m.
Okay, I've got to make this quick. If you brought your book and you would like Charles to sign it, he will be at the table near the door. If you want to purchase a book and have it signed, Amy is over there, Amy from Bard's Alley. And again, thank you, Bard's Alley, for supporting us on this. Ann Mugler also is at the donation tables, and she's also selling these beautiful Crooked Steeple cards. Take a look at them. They're actually works of art, and you may want to pick one of those up as your souvenir for today. If you like what you heard today, I would invite you to join us on February 28th for Tara Shelton Harris, who will be talking about her book, Where the Wildflowers Grow. And on April 25th, Jeffrey Dale Lockton will be right here to discuss his book, Red Clay Susie. A final thanks to all of you for attending and supporting the Crooked Steeple. And if you've never seen the Crooked Steeple, go outside and look straight up. It is in fact crooked. And finally, a big thanks to the launch team who worked behind the scenes to get the word out and invite everyone they know to this event. And with that, thanks for coming.